Good afternoon and welcome to the media presentation for our Methane Tracker and Roadmap this afternoon. We're delighted to be joined this afternoon by Dr. Birol, who will provide an introduction, and by Tim Gould, the head of the Energy Supply Outlook and Investment Division at the IEA, as well as Christoph Maglade and Casey Michaels, who all contributed to the reports. This press presentation is being live streamed. We will hear from our panelists for some introduction and presentation of the main findings, and we will have an opportunity for some Q&A from the journalists. I would like to point out to the journalists to please use the Q&A box through the Zoom channel. The findings of the report, all the conclusions, all the data are available on our website for free, and you can find them at iea.org. With that, I would like to turn the floor to Dr. Birol. Thank you.
Greetings from International Energy Agency headquarters. Once again, we are together. Some of you might have followed or heard that last Monday we had a press conference and we have outlined the work of the IEA this year. And as I said, at that very press conference, International Energy Agency puts the clean energy transitions at the heart of its work. Why? Because we have a climate challenge, a major challenge, and climate challenge is essentially an energy challenge. Why? Because more than 80% of the emissions causing climate change comes from the energy sector. So as International Energy Agency, we have outlined several projects, initiatives, summits this year, which we hope to address our climate challenge. And today, we are going to talk to you about a subject which unfortunately doesn't get enough attention from policymakers, from energy industry, from citizens, and elsewhere, which is the issue of role of methane in addressing our climate problems. Dear colleagues, methane makes a major contribution to global warming, and it is much more potent, much more powerful than the other gas we talk about, which is carbon dioxide. And it is the reason we thought we should, first of all, look at the methane emissions worldwide, how big they are, where do they come from which countries, and second, what kind of policies governments, operators, industry can put in place in order to minimize, if not nullify, those emissions. So therefore, we have two announcements to make today. One about the significance of methane emissions in the fight against climate change, and second, what kind of policy tools we can have in hand in order to minimize, if not nullify, those emissions. Now, some of you may know that we have been working on this subject since several years. In addition to the significance of methane issue, lack of reliable data is an area that drove the IEA's attention to this subject. We at the IEA believe that the reliable data is the first step in order to address any problem we face. There is a principle of physics which says nature hates a vacuum. Nature hates a vacuum. And in terms of energy sector, we translate it into IEA's work, and we say the IEA hates lack of reliable data. So it is the reason we brought this data in order to measure the problem, and at the same time to avoid some actors to hide behind the lack of reliable data to act. It is the reason we are coming with this work. Now, first, the numbers. How big is the problem? This is my first announcement. Since a few years, we are working on this issue, and we have developed a methane tracker. There are still some uncertainties in terms of methane emissions around the world, but we committed ourselves to come up with the best available data. And I am very happy to say that our methane tracker, our data, quickly become the global reference for all the relevant actors in the energy world. We are constantly working to bring new data points and improve our estimates. And I am very pleased to report you that this year, for the first time, we have included full year satellite data for 2020, and which I am going to tell you in a moment. The data for 2020, how much methane emissions occurred last year, is about 70 million tons of methane. And it came mainly from oil and gas operations. There are methane emissions from the coal sector. My colleague, Mr. Gould, will tell you about it as well. But this is the key issue that we wanted to highlight: 70 million tons of methane emitted last year. In order to understand how big it is, 70 million tons of methane is equivalent to all the energy sector emissions in terms of CO2 of entire European Union. So entire European Union CO2 emissions is equivalent to world's 70 million tons of methane emissions. It's a huge, huge, huge amount of emissions. Bearing in mind how powerful, how potent this methane gas is, I think with this number underlines the significance and urgency of tackling them. Several countries contribute to this 70 million tons of methane emissions, but top 3 countries are: number 1, Russia; number 2, United States of America; number 3, Iran. These 3 countries are top emitters of methane. Now, 2020, 70 million tons of emissions. When we look at the 2019, it is 10% lower than 2019 data. But unfortunately, this is not as a result of the new strict measures or policies put in place. The vast majority of this decline is due to less oil and gas production across the world. And we want to appeal all governments and the industry that we should make everything possible in our power, and I will tell you in a moment, we have a lot of things in our power, that the 2019 methane emissions remains the historical peak, and we see a structural decline in the methane emissions. Now, one final thing about this methane emissions before going to how to tackle this and what are the jobs for governments to do. The methane emissions, and my colleagues, Mr. Gould and his colleagues, look at the abatement options of methane. And what they tell us in their report as Mr. Muvat also mentioned, which is freely available to everybody who wants to consult it. In the report, they say that the significant chunks of these abatements are either with zero cost or at very little cost they can be abated. So this is something which is very important. And on top of that, we should know that the methane emission reductions, they have a price if they are done, which is the price of course, natural gas today. So this is a key issue, and this is an issue that I believe no government, no industry who says that I am serious to address climate change can simply ignore. This is the big issue. It's number one. Number two, and this is my second announcement, at the IEA, we not only define and put a spot on the problems, but we come up with the policy solutions, recommendations, which can be implementable by governments. So data, IEA's work, analysis, IEA's work, and implementation, again, IEA comes up with some suggestions. And in this respect, we have prepared a clear how-to guide that the governments and regulators can use, bring down emissions from oil and gas operations. We think there is a strong and critical role for governments here to provide incentives for early action by companies, bringing transparency, which is an area which we are very sensitive about. It is the reason we come up with these numbers. And again, for governments to support innovation to get the results. Now, some governments, some companies are saying that they are ready to address the methane issue, but they do not have the reliable data. They don't have the reliable information. They don't have the tools to address these issues. And they want to know what the other countries do, what are the successful examples around the world, so that they can get inspiration from those countries, from those cases, in order to put together their policy tools. And it is the reason why we have come up with such a roadmap to address this issue, to provide recommendations to governments. My colleagues look at several governments and regions, more than 50 countries, including some parts of US, Nigeria, Iraq, Mexico, China, Russia, and others, some good and also bad experiences, so that we can all learn from that. All of this information we have gathered on the policy side, what we have learned from the different experiences, are all this information is freely available and accessible in our databases. Anybody wishes can go in and look at and learn about that. Now, I would like to finish by giving some suggestions, recommendations to governments and companies after coming up with the big number of 70 million tons, and also announcing our new roadmap, how to guide the government's roadmap. First, we are very happy at the IEA that the governments around the world come up with commitments and pledges for 2050, bringing the emissions to net zero. And one important avenue we would like to recommend, ask governments to do, is that their commitments not only include the CO2 emissions, but also methane, and they include those methane-related pledges, targets in their work, in their roadmaps. So this is something we believe is critical. Second, when we look at the energy markets, which we do on a daily basis at the IEA, we see that the reason for action for companies or governments, it is not only environmental or reputational. It is beyond that. There are increasing signs that the consumers around the world are looking carefully at the emission profile of different sources of natural gas when they decide to buy which gas from which countries and what kind of footprint they have. So it is also a commercial issue. It is not only a reputational risk. It is not only an environmental risk, but we believe it may well be a commercial risk, and I believe it will be more so in the next months and years to come. Now, last Monday, I announced that the International Energy Agency will provide world's first roadmap, world's energy sector's roadmap to net zero by 2050. This will also include the methane emissions in addition to the carbon dioxide emissions, which I believe important to note and bring everybody's attention, because those emissions will be like the CO2 emissions, which will be tracked by the IEA on a yearly basis, whether or not governments are in line with their pledges. Are they on track or off track? Let me finish by saying that I believe, personally, looking at the issue of methane emissions, it is not an option by companies or governments, but it's an obligation for companies or governments to minimize, if not nullify, the methane emissions from their operations. With this, I would like to reiterate that the International Energy Agency is determined to lead global clean energy transitions, and our work on methane emission reductions is an integral part of our efforts. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Executive Director. And I would like to take this opportunity now to go into a little bit more detail on the two pieces of analysis that we've released today. And then I'll be joined by my colleagues, Christoph McGlade and Casey Michaels, to answer your questions. And I'd like to start with just a few words of context on methane itself. Methane is released to the atmosphere by a number of natural processes each year, but also by processes related to human activity. And the concentration of methane in the atmosphere is now 2.5 times what it was in the pre-industrial era. And that increase that we're seeing today is very worrying. Once released, methane doesn't stay around for long in the atmosphere. It's around 12 years compared with centuries for CO2. But it is a much more potent greenhouse gas, as Dr. Birol was mentioning. You can see from the slide that the largest source of methane emissions from human activity is agriculture, closely followed by the energy sector. And within the energy sector, there are methane emissions from coal, from oil and gas, and from bioenergy. So a question that you might have is, given this picture, why are we focusing on oil and gas emissions? The answer is relatively simple, because they are large, and because we can see from the evidence from the best performing countries and companies that there is huge scope to reduce them cost effectively. And that's a little bit the background for these two launches that we've had this morning. the tracker itself, and then the regulatory roadmap. And I'd like to take each of these in turn. And since the tracker is a sort of interactive online tool, the best way to understand it is just to pay it a quick visit. This is the interface that you see when you visit it on the website. The default is to show global data, but we can go to a range of countries, and we will take Algeria. Scrutiny falls on Algeria by virtue of the fact that it begins with the letter A. And you can see all of the different elements of the IEA estimates here on the left-hand side of the screen. And you can also see on the right-hand side how the IEA's estimate compares with other comparable sources. Now, a couple of things on the left-hand side. Just to say that the data on oil and gas methane emissions are improving, but they really are still poor, incomplete, they're sometimes contradictory. And so this tracker is our attempt to reconcile all of the available information into a coherent and internally consistent set of estimates. And as the Executive Director mentioned, this is something that we're continuously looking to improve by integrating new sources of data. So I'd like to draw your attention to the top element here, which is that satellite detected large emitters that you can see in the case of Algeria. But for each country, we also include information on abatement, looking at the different options for abatement and putting them on a cost curve. And just to underline that while the data uncertainties are high, we know more than enough today to motivate strong action on abatement. So we spend a lot of time at IEA looking at different ways to bring down emissions of different sorts. And action on methane is consistently amongst the most cost-effective approaches. You see on the left-hand side of the screen, particularly cost-effective in our view, in this case, is leak detection and repair. So that's LDAR within the glossary there of abatement technologies. So this is in a sense, the micro picture. What about the macro one? We go on to where the Executive Director also spoke about the total emissions. So this is where you can see on the screen the 70 million tons that the Executive Director mentioned. You can also less than our estimate for 2019. It looks like good news, and there are some good news in there, but in our view, a large part of this drop occurred not because companies were necessarily taking more care to avoid methane leaks, but simply because in 2020, they were producing less oil and gas. And as such, there is a risk that this downward trend is reversed. So would like to echo the sentiments from Dr. Birol. The immediate task now for the oil and gas industry is to make sure there is no such rebound and that 2019 becomes the peak year for oil and gas methane emissions. So in practice, if we extend our view out to 2030 and put in the way that these emissions are projected in our sustainable development scenario, you can see that broadly speaking, that trend for 2020 is consistent with the sorts of annual reductions that would be required in that scenario. But please don't imagine that this means that we are somehow on track. There is a huge amount to do. We've also spoken about the innovative element this year for our methane analysis. We've included full year satellite data for 2020 in our latest update, thanks to our ongoing partnership with Kairos, an Earth observation firm. So overall, for 2020, this data accounted for some 5.5 million tons of methane emissions. That's less than 10% of the total volumes that we estimate are being emitted from oil and gas operations. So these are really just the larger plumes or so-called super emitters that are visible from space. As we saw just now, there are lots of other emissions in countries in addition to these that we include in the methane tracker. So the slide here shows the geographical dispersal of these leaks differentiated by flow rates. In practice, these leaks might not last for very long, but while they emit, they are very damaging. And just to put that in context, a flow rate of 20 tons per hour, which is one of the smaller dots that you can see on the screen here, is equivalent to emissions from a 600 megawatt coal-fired power plant. So there are some limitations to the existing satellite coverage. They don't provide reliable measurement, for example, over equatorial regions or northern areas or for offshore operations. However, this is a truly dynamic area. We're very excited about the prospect of more satellite data becoming available in the years to come. That will be a great gain in terms of transparency. And indeed, there will just be a lot more measured data becoming available in general because of initiatives to improve company level reporting and also new scientific studies. One thing that's become clearer with every iteration of the methane tracker is the large variation in performance across different countries and companies. You're looking here at the emissions by country, but I'd also like to draw your attention to the yellow dots that appear for each country entry. That's the sort of methane intensity of oil and gas production. So that's our estimate of the amount leaked for every unit of production in the country concerned. And the striking thing that you can see from our data is that the difference in intensity varies by a factor of more than 100 between the worst and the best performing countries. That's a depressing message in some ways, but it's also possibly an encouraging one. Depressing because it shows the needless waste and damage that we're doing today. Encouraging because it underlines that for many countries, huge and rapid improvements in performance should be possible. And I'd like to follow up on this discussion about the cost effectiveness of action on methane. A significant share of these emissions can be abated at no net cost because the value of the captured methane is sufficient to cover the cost of the abatement measure. So the precise share of emissions that can be avoided at no net cost, it varies from year to year, it varies from region to region. One of the key variables there is the prevailing price for natural gas. Natural gas prices were relatively low in 2020 because of the crisis. And so when we updated the numbers for our new tracker, the share of abatement that pays for itself came down. But it will pick up again as natural gas prices rise. So if we look at the sorts of natural gas prices that have been prevailing in recent years, you can see that a large share of that abatement possibility now comes in at negative prices, indicating that it is particularly cost effective. But these variations in prices, these variations in the economic incentives from year to year, that really just underlines to us the importance of well-designed regulation to ensure that the public policy objective of reducing emissions is not diminished by the effects of price volatility and commodity price cycles. So from this look at the methane tracker, I hope we've kind of delineated the problem, and then the roadmap that we've also talked about intends to provide guidance on what policymakers and regulators can do. So to develop the roadmap and the toolkit, we started by undertaking a broad survey of existing methane regulations around the world. And the results of this are found in the IEA policies databases, which now include entries from more than 50 global jurisdictions. And the tables that you can see here provide a snapshot of the different types of policies that exist, categorized among the four main regulatory approaches. So on the screen now, you have more prescriptive or command and control type requirements, but there are also performance-based approaches, and likewise the use of economic instruments such as taxes or fees, and there are also information-based instruments. And you can find much more detail about these four approaches, including the advantages and disadvantages of each. And I can see already on the questions coming in that there's one on the use of taxation in this respect. And you can find many detailed examples and case studies in the work that we've released today. And you can also see that although there are some visible gaps in many countries, many jurisdictions already have some requirements in place that can affect methane emissions. This means that many countries already have some building blocks that can serve as a foundation for new or updated regulation. But it also means that there's a lot of experience out there that policymakers can look to for inspiration and best practices. And from this starting point, we developed a step-by-step roadmap for policymakers looking to either step up their action or to start from scratch on methane regulations. And the process for implementation unfolds in 3 distinct phases that you can see on the screen here. The first is more about information gathering. The second has a focus on defining, developing, and drafting the regulatory proposal. And then, very important last phase, implementation phase, including measures on compliance and processes to review and adapt the policy over time. And although that's presented sequentially here, in practice, the steps may take place in a different order and may overlap and feed back into each other as you go along. This is my last slide, and I would just use this to highlight some of the insights that have emerged from this regulatory analysis. This also develops some of the discussion that we had last week. We held a meeting for regulators and experts in methane regulation here at the IEA, well, a virtual meeting hosted by the IEA together with our friends and colleagues at the UN Environment Programme. Very good attendance, lots of different countries at different stages of development in their approach to this issue were there. And a few points came through very clearly. A lot of discussion around how you must be tailoring your approach to local circumstances and the local situation. So you would clearly devise a very different regime for a market dominated by a single national oil company than you would for a market with a large number of independent producers. Many participants also return to this crucial importance of political buy-in, a clear vision of what the policy is designed to achieve. Likewise, the importance of dialogue with different stakeholder groups. But there was also a question which we've encountered many times in this regulatory work is, what can we do in the absence of good methane data? So, and one of the things that we would like to emphasize with this work is that effective policy tools exist and can be implemented now, even without accurate baseline data on emissions. To be sure, better information can enable more effective regulatory requirements, such as performance and market-based instruments. But there are some things that you can do straight away. Some prescriptive or command and control requirements, such as leak detection and repair or equipment mandates. They can be implemented without such data, and they can be a very effective and powerful first step. And then, of course, over time, countries may be able to improve and supplement these requirements as more robust measurement reporting regimes are put in place. And so with that, I hope that this presentation has provided you with a sense of the problem, also some of the solutions, and also a sense of the urgency behind this question. And I look forward very much to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, for your presentation. So we will turn shortly to the Q&A portion of this presentation. We'll take a 2-minute break to compile the questions, and we will be right back. Thank you. Great, we're back. So joining us for the Q&A session, again, we have Tim Gould, who heads the Energy Supply Outlook and Investment Division. We're joined also by Christoph McGlade and Casey Michaels, who all contributed to the report. So we have a number of questions. I will bundle them by threes and then pass them on. The first question from Matthias Falkengard from Energy Watch. It's a question about Norway, where there's a tax on flaring. Do you see that as a good idea to prevent too much flaring? Essentially, this is probably a question for UKC on tools, regulatory tools. The second question, two questions I think I'll bring together. One from Carlos Anchondo from EE News. Is the estimated 10% drop in methane emissions from the global oil and gas sector last year the largest ever recorded drop? And a question from Camilla Hodgson from the Financial Times. What sort of emission reduction do we need to be on track for Paris? Is that achievable? Perhaps those can go to you and Christoph, to Tim and Christoph. And then third question, how soon will we be able to get reliable data for specific gas supply routes or even LNG cargoes? Casey?
And thank you for the thank you for this question about the Norwegian Flaring Tax. Is this a little? Oh, that's a little better. Okay. Thank you for this question on the Norwegian Flaring Tax, which the example of the flaring tax illustrates one of the key aspects of use of taxation as a solution for methane. It can potentially be a very efficient approach because it allows operators to seek out the most cost-effective reduction opportunities. And Norway, in fact, has implemented both a tax on flaring as well as a tax on offshore methane emissions, which illustrates the key drawback is that this type of regulation generally requires very accurate accounting of and measurement of the emissions or the thing that's being taxed. So it works quite well for flaring, where the government already has good knowledge and good information on on how much flaring is taking place, which operators are doing it, but it can be less useful in situations where we don't know that. For example, with the fugitive emissions, where we might be better placed to go forward with something in the near term, regulations designed to improve our data and information about the emissions before we go to more efficient regulatory approaches such as taxes.
I will take the question on how soon we will be able to get reliable data for specific gas supply routes or for LNG cargoes. And certainly the data which we released today does provide information on these points. But I think it's also fair to say that more data, more measured information will be needed if we want to really pinpoint emission levels from very specific trade routes. So for example, we're aware that there are a number of measurement campaigns underway to assess how leaky the LNG process might be, whether this is from LNG ships or whether it's from the liquefaction process. And we very much look forward to seeing these results as they come through in the future months. But certainly also satellites can help in this regard. And indeed, it's increasingly possible for satellites to monitor emissions from specific facilities on a very fine time resolution and also fine spatial resolution. But as Tim mentioned in his main presentation, it is always going to be the case that existing satellites are going to struggle to see everywhere around the world all of the time. For example, it may not be possible to provide real-time data for offshore operations or for operations in northern latitudes. However, the next generation of satellites and satellite processing should hopefully be able to provide further and further insights. So the short answer is I think we are getting there, but we're not quite there yet. We're able to pinpoint whether one supply route would be better or worse than another supply route.
Thanks very much, Christoph. Thanks, Casey, for those answers. I'll take the two questions, which I think we can take together. Is the estimated 10% drop in methane emissions the largest ever recorded drop? and what sort of emissions reductions do we need annually to be on track for Paris, and is that realistically achievable? So on the scale of the drop in 2020, certainly if you look back at the time series that we have put together, then that 10% drop would be the largest. However, I would caution against, in a sense, drawing conclusions that rely too heavily on sort of year-by-year variations, just because the uncertainty over the methane data is extremely high. But the indications that we have are that there was a significant drop in 2020, and in all probability, this was the largest ever. And indeed, that sort of magnitude would be required to over the next decade, every year, in order to be on track for what we have in our sustainable development scenario. So that is a scenario that is in line with the Paris Agreement. How did we arrive at that? Essentially, in our view, around 70–75% of all of the oil and gas methane emissions today are possible to abate. And so the vast majority of those, indeed almost all of those, all of that potential is used up over the next 10 years. Is that realistic? I think one of the lessons that you can take from the experience of companies that have really engaged on methane emissions reductions in recent years is that this has proved to be more cost effective than they had anticipated up front. And they have succeeded in bringing methane emissions down by a greater amount than they had initially envisaged. So we find that to be a very encouraging signal of what is possible. Certainly when we look at many of the regions with the highest emissions, we feel that everything that we understand about this problem leads us to believe that rapid early reductions in these emissions are not only possible, but very, very desirable from a social and environmental perspective.
Many thanks, Tim. So we have another batch of questions. I'll take them by threes, and just in the interest of time, this could be our final round of 3 questions. So from Adam Vaughan from New Scientist, 2 questions. What are your expectations for regulation of methane emissions from oil and gas under a new Biden administration? Second question is your point about more methane abatement having no net cost at higher natural gas prices, another argument for wider, higher carbon taxes. So 2 questions there. And perhaps a third question, should methane abatement be part of sustainable recoveries? Christoph?
So I will start with the second question on whether having more methane abatement at higher gas prices is a good reason for there to be more CO2 prices. And I think the first thing to recognize here is that there are some countries and some companies that do apply CO2 prices to methane emissions. This is not, unfortunately, the rule, but we have seen that by them doing so, that they can reduce methane emissions quite significantly. But as we show in a regulatory roadmap, it's not just about pricing emissions. There are other ways in which you can realize meaningful levels of reductions in methane emissions. It's unfortunately the case that because of the pandemic, that the gas prices being so low, that the level of abatement that is possible is much lower in 2020 than it has been in previous years. We had, as was heard from Tim and from the Executive Director, only around 10% of reductions in 2020 could be realized at no net cost. In previous years, that's been closer to 40 or even to 50%. And so to avoid this sort of fluctuation that there can be in the level of reductions that are possible at no net cost, this really is where regulation is important, whether that is through CO2 prices, whether it's through mandating leak detection repair programs, or mandating changes in equipment, for example, all of these things can play a role in helping to realize the level of reductions that we see, for example, in a sustainable development scenario.
And I will take the question regarding the prospects for oil and gas methane regulations under the Biden administration, the first question. And just to note that we've already heard from incoming administration officials that that strong action on climate will be a top priority. And given the potency of methane, we see as action on methane would be a very good first step in that. And there's also been a lot of discussion, and it seems likely that we'll see an early review of the 2020 regulatory action taken by EPA. And we just like to note that this is really an opportunity to build on some of the existing strategies that have already been put in place and that are still in place following that regulatory action. One is that the 2020 provision left in place, created new provisions on flexibility and on how to incorporate new technologies as solutions and as in terms of meeting the requirements, which are very encouraging. And of course, we'd also expect that there'd be a review of the leak detection and repair program, which continues to operate on volatile organic compounds. And we would also just note that the EPA in this regard may look to the states and may look to the states who have, such as Colorado, who have already been implementing some innovative regulatory tools over the past several years.
And I will take the final question on whether methane abatement could be part of sustainable recoveries. In the publication that we released last June on sustainable recoveries, we absolutely included methane emissions reductions as part of this, alongside investment into renewables, into efficiency, into the many other elements that could be part of sustainable recoveries. And there were two main reasons why we included methane emissions reductions as part of that. First of all, it would provide a new source of employment for oil and gas workers who have potentially been made redundant by the crisis, but also because very much so of the cost-efficient way in which we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by reducing methane emissions. So it's also bringing back to this previous question on CO2 prices. The level of CO2 price that would be required in order to bring about all of the reductions that we see is around about $25 per ton. So we estimate around about 75% of methane emissions coming from oil and gas operations could be avoided today if there were to be a $25 per ton CO2 price, which is applied to methane, and if this was to be applied globally. So really, in terms of the level of emissions reductions that it can be realized at a low cost, really does suggest that including action on methane would be a very positive step within sustainable recoveries.
Great, thank you very much, Christoph, Tim, Casey. This concludes the presentation for our methane work today and report and tracker. I encourage everyone to download, find the analysis and the tracker online. Again, as our executive director said, all of the analysis and the data is for free. Thank you very much for following us. If the press has more questions, please do send us your questions at press@iea.org. We'd be very happy to answer them. Thank you.